3 men in chainmail pointed their spears at his chest. He couldn't understand a word of what they were shouting. He didn't understand how he'd ended up in the ditch beneath this wall. He knows only one thing. Yesterday, he died behind the wheel during the night shift, and today he woke up in a strange, emaciated body in a world where even the moat was dug by clumsy hands. Dan Carter opens his eyes. A gray sky, cold. The stench of manure and wet stone. Water seeps through his shirt and chills his back. He sits up, runs his hand over the ground. Soil, clay beneath it. A reddish tint indicates good, dense clay. Stone lies further down, about 2 meters away. And this is where the strangest part begins. He lies in a ditch beneath the wall of a foreign world, and the first thing he does is calculate cubic meters. The ditch is dug crookedly. The angle is too shallow. The walls are crumbling and filling the bottom with loose debris. The wall is dry laid. The mortar still holds at the bottom. Up top, the stones are just piled on top of each other. A single tower looms over all this squalor. Stocky, square. There's zero visibility from it because a hill 100 paces away blocks half the horizon. Dan takes it all in 30 seconds, and only then does it dawn on him. He's not at home. He remembers the night shift, the road. He remembers his eyes closing for a second, a blow, then nothing. He looks at his hands. They're not his. Thinner, paler, no calluses from the keyboard. He's dead. And at the same time, he's sitting in the mud, figuring out how much dirt he needs to dig out to fix this ditch. People are yelling from above, metal clangs. 3 guards at the edge of the ditch are pointing their spears. Dan raises his hands. One of them climbs down, grabs him by the collar, yanks him up like a puppy. This body weighs 60 kilos. The guard is twice as heavy and drags him with one hand. They toss him onto the grass. The 3 stand and talk among themselves. Dan doesn't understand the words but gets the tone. They don't know what to do with him. Strange clothes, a strange face, a strange man in the moat. They lead him to the tower. Inside, it's dark and stinky. Dan notices it right away. Zero ventilation. Smoke from the hearth escapes through a hole in the ceiling. Half of it stays inside. People breathe this every day. A narrow staircase with worn-down steps leads upstairs. They push him in the back. On the second floor, a woman is sitting at a table. Young, maybe 22. Dark hair pulled back, pale face. Her fingers on the table tremble slightly. She's scared, but her voice is steady. She asks a question. Dan doesn't understand. She repeats it. He shakes his head. She tries another language, a third. None of them. He says in English that he's no enemy. She frowns. The words are foreign to her. Silence. Dan looks around the room. The table is against a blank wall. Light from a loophole falls on the floor, not on the table. The map hangs too high. She has to stand on tiptoe to see the northern edge. Dan takes in every detail automatically. And then he notices a piece of charcoal on the table. A burnt branch. He pokes at it, pokes at the floor, draws a picture. The woman stares for a long time. Then she nods. Dan drops to his knees and draws directly on the stone. A tower, a wall, a moat. The woman stands up and approaches. The guards lean in. Dan draws what he saw outside. He draws a line showing the water level. The moat is empty. Next to it, he draws a well. That very stone well by the wall that he spotted while they were dragging him across the courtyard. He draws a line from the well to the moat, a channel, 20 paces. He indicates the slope with his hand. The water will flow on its own. Gravity. He pokes at the moat and depicts it filling up. She draws an outlet beyond the wall. The excess flows into the river. The moat fills up. No flowers, no buckets. The woman looks at the sketch, at Dan, back at the sketch. She throws something at the guards. They exchange glances. One taps his temple with a finger, but she repeats herself and her voice hardens. The guards leave. Dan remains on his knees in front of the drawing. The woman sits down. She points at herself. Eleanor. She points at him. Dan beats his chest. Dan, she repeats. Then she points to the sketch and asks. He can't make out the words, but the meaning is clear. Will it work? Dan nods. They give him a corner in the lower hall, some straw, a piece of bread, a mug with something sour. He chews and thinks. The spawn is so-so. There's only one tower and it's falling apart. The wall is full of holes. The moat is dry. Few people around. But the clay underfoot is good. A forest to the north. There's a river. The stone in the walls is hewn, so there must be a quarry nearby. Materials galore. He collapses onto the straw and closes his eyes. Tomorrow he'll start with the moat. The morning begins with a rooster crowing and a kick from the guard. Dan steps out into the courtyard and sees Ashford in the light of day. 40 paces long, 30 wide. A tower in the northern corner. The wall runs in a crooked ring. It has sagged in 3 places and is propped up with beams. The gate is sturdy, but the hinges are rusted and the gate hangs crooked. A line of women with buckets stands by the well, chickens underfoot. Dan counts. 12 houses, maybe 15. About 30 people in sight. 7 guards. That's the entire garrison of Ashford. Dan walks toward the well. The women step aside and glance at him warily. He peeks inside. The water is high, 2 meters to the surface. He looks at the moat, at the well. He paces the distance. 18 steps. He was wrong yesterday, not 20. The elevation difference looks like 1.5 meters. That's more than enough. Eleanor appears at the tower's threshold. Beside her stands an old man in a worn leather breastplate, a gray mustache, a stern gaze. He looks at Dan as if he were a rat in the pantry. This is Aldrich, the Castellan of Ashford. He ruled this place for 30 years under the old baron. Eleanor says something to him. Aldrich replies curtly and angrily. Dan doesn't understand the words, but gets the gist. The old man is against it, against the stranger, against the drawings on the floor, against everything. Eleanor turns to Dan. She points to the well, to the moat. She raises her eyebrows. She's giving him a chance. Dan holds up 10 fingers. Disappointing gesture. Eleanor gives the order. By noon, Dan has 10 peasants and 10 shovels, wooden with iron edges, blunt, heavy, but they work. Dan draws a line with a stick from the well to the wall. He shows where to dig, how deep. The peasants look on, confused. He takes a shovel himself. His hands are weak. His body feels foreign. The first blow lands on his palm. A neighbor drives his shovel in 1.5 feet. Dan is no digger, but he sets the direction, the depth, the angle. The peasants dig. Dan walks along the trench and checks the slope. He doesn't know the local word for level. He takes a straight stick, ties a pebble to a string, the simplest plumb line. The peasants eye this contraption with suspicion, but the stick with the pebble doesn't lie. The slope is even. By evening, the canal is half finished, 1/2 meter deep. Aldrich comes by twice, stands there, watches. He leaves in silence. By noon the next day, the canal reaches the wall. Dan shows where to break through. 2 men with pickaxes chisel away for an hour. The last stone falls. Dan crouches down and waits. At first, nothing. Then a thin trickle. Then wider. Water flows through the canal, slowly, confidently. Following the slope, Dan measured with a stick and a pebble. Through the wall, into the moat. The moat fills up. The peasants freeze. Eleanor stands on the wall and looks down. The water rises. By evening, the moat is full, clean running water. The excess flows down the slope into the river. It won't get stagnant. It won't dry up. Not a single bucket. Eleanor climbs down. She sits on a rock at the edge. She stares at the water for a long time. Dan stands nearby, covered in clay from head to toe. He speaks in English, saying things she won't understand. It was a training. Now the real construction will begin. Eleanor looks at him. She didn't understand the words, but she understood something else. The man who in 2 days did what no one could do in 20 years stands before her and waits. She stands up, nods, points at the tower, at the wall, at everything around her, then at him. Dan understands. She hands the construction over to him. The first week was hell. Dan didn't know the language. He couldn't explain the simplest thing with words. He had to draw every task with a charcoal stick on stone or on the ground or on whatever he could find. The villagers looked at his drawings and exchanged glances. Some understood. Most didn't. Dan drew again. Simpler. Larger. One peasant named Godric turned out to be smarter than the rest. He was a carpenter, hands like shovels, a face like an axe. But he looked at the drawing, and a minute later he nodded and went to get to work. Godric became Dan's first foreman, though neither of them knew that word. On the third day, a wagon arrived in Ashford. Inside sat a girl of about 19. Black hair, a narrow face, dark eyes that moved quickly and intently. She spoke to Eleanor in the local language, but with a noticeable accent. Then she heard Dan muttering in English over yet another blueprint. She stopped, turned around, and said in broken but understandable English, "You speak the Imperial Western dialect." Dan stared at her. She introduced herself. Hana So-yeon, daughter of a trade envoy from the Eastern Kingdom, stranded here when the trade routes were cut off by war. She spoke 4 languages, and the English she called Imperial Western was one of them. Over the next 2 days, Dan's world changed. Hana translated, quickly, accurately. She didn't just repeat his words. She understood what he was trying to explain and found the right local terms. When Dan said foundation, she translated it as the root of the wall. When he said drainage, she said a path for water. The peasants finally began to understand what was expected of them. Dan began with a survey. He walked the entire length of the field in a single day. Hana walked beside him and took notes. The wall had a perimeter of 320 paces. The thickness at the bottom was 2 paces. At the top, it was less than 1 pace in places. The height ranged from 3 meters in the south to 5 in the north. 3 sections had sagged critically. One opening was simply boarded up with wooden shields. There was one tower, square, about 12 meters high. The first floor was stone. The second was half wood. The roof was leaking. There was one gate, one well. The quarry was an hour's walk to the southeast. The forest began 20 minutes to the north. The river flowed 500 paces to the west. Clay was everywhere. Dan sat down on a rock by the gate and looked at his notes. In his mind, it all looked like a resource map at the start of a difficult game. There was stone, but it was far away. There was a forest, and it was close by. Clay was underfoot. Water was nearby. There were few helping hands. Time was short. There were almost no tools. The first thing he did was go to the blacksmith. He found the smithy behind the wall, a low stone shed, a thatched roof. Inside, it was dark and hot. A woman stood by the anvil, tall, red hair tied in a bun, hands covered in burns and calluses. She was 1.5 feet broader in the shoulders than Dan. This was Brigitte Stein, Ashford's chief and only blacksmith, a widow. She looked down at Dan, then at Hana. Hana explained that this man wanted to look the smithy. Brigitte said something short and gruff. Hana translated it as her saying she didn't have time and that you should get lost. Dan didn't leave. He stood in the doorway and watched. The anvil was too high for Brigitte. She worked with her shoulders hunched, which meant her back ached by evening every day. The bellows were hand-operated. She pumped them with her left hand while holding the tongs in her right. This meant she couldn't maintain the heat and work the metal at the same time. She needed an apprentice just to pump the bellows. Or she needed mechanical bellows. Dan turned and left. Brigitte muttered something clearly unflattering at his back. Hana didn't bother to translate. On the 4th day, Dan gathered everyone he could in the square in front of the tower. Eleanor stood on the porch. Aldrich stood nearby, his face stony. 7 guards, Godric with 5 carpenters, a dozen peasants, women, children on the outskirts, 60 people in all. Dan was drawing on a large, flat stone. Hana translated. He explained that the enemy would arrive in 3 months, maybe sooner. The wall in its current state wouldn't last a day. The tower was useless. The gate is weak. The moat is enough to delay them, but not stop them. Aldrich interrupted. Hana translated his words. This stranger has been walking around for 3 days, pointing his finger. The walls have stood for 30 years. The walls will hold. Dan asked Hana to ask Aldrich if he had seen the Horde take fortresses. Aldrich fell silent. He hadn't seen it, but he'd heard rumors. Through Hana, Dan explained that the Horde digs. It doesn't storm the walls head-on. It digs under them. A wall standing on a shallow foundation will collapse from a tunnel in 2 days. He pointed to the south wall. The foundation there isn't deeper than an elbow. Aldrich had stood on the south side for 30 years and didn't know that the wall beneath his feet was held up by nothing more than a promise. His expression didn't change, but he fell silent. Dan continued to sketch. He divided the work into stages. Stage 1, 1 week. Reinforce the foundation of the south wall. Dig a trench along the base. Fill it with a clay-stone mixture. It's not ideal, but it will provide a margin of safety. Stage 2, 2 weeks. Standardize the stone block. He drew a rectangle, 2 cubits by 1 cubit by 1 cubit. From now on, all stones are cut to the same size. No on-site adjustments, no unique pieces. One size, one shape. Peasants can build a wall without a master mason because the blocks fit in any position. Godric looked at the drawing and nodded slowly. He was a carpenter, but he understood the principle. Identical logs are easier to stack than mismatched ones. Stage 3, 1 month. The second tower, on the south side, square. The same design as the first, but with the correct orientation. From it, the hill to the north and the approaches from the south would be visible. 2 towers provide a cross-sectional view. There will be no blind spots. Eleanor listened in silence. When Dan finished, she asked one question. Hana translated. She asked if there were enough people. Dan answered honestly, no, there aren't enough. But he would show them how to make each person work as hard as 3. Not because they would work harder, but because they would work smarter. The next day, work began. Dan divided the people into teams, 3 teams of 8 people each. The first team dug a trench along the south wall. The second team hauled stone from the quarry. The third team mixed clay mortar and poured it. Each team performed a single task. 1. Without switching tasks. No distractions. The first team dug, the second carried, the third poured. When one team finished a section, the next took over, a conveyor belt. The peasants had never worked like this before. Usually, everyone did everything themselves. Dug, carried, mixed, laid. It was familiar, but slow. The new system showed results by the end of the second day. A third of the trench along the south wall was ready. The old way would have taken a week. Aldrich came, looked, and left. His face looked as if he'd seen a cat walking on its hind legs. He didn't believe it, but he saw it. On the 6th day, an event occurred that changed their attitude toward Dan. He stood by the quarry and watched as the peasants chiseled the stones by hand. Each block took nearly an hour. Dan watched this and saw 3 problems. The tool was dull, the strike was wrong, and most importantly, they were chipping the stone away from the block incorrectly. They were striking across the grain instead of along it. The stone was crumbling instead of breaking off in a clean piece. Dan took a chisel from a stonemason. He demonstrated. He rotated it 90 degrees. He struck along the grain. The piece came away cleanly, an almost perfect rectangle. The stonemason stared at the piece, then at Dan. Then he tried it himself. It worked. Stone extraction doubled in a single day. That evening, Godric came to Dan, sat down beside him, held out a flask of something strong stuff, and said a long sentence that Hana translated as follows. He says his grandfather was a stonemason, and his grandfather always said you have to listen to the stone. He says you hear the stone better than his grandfather did. By the end of the first week, the foundation of the south wall had been reinforced. The moat was full. The work crew system was functioning, and Dan Carter ceased to be the strange outsider they tolerated. He became the strange outsider they listened to. The second week brought the first enemy within the walls. Not the Horde. Aldrich. The old Castellan couldn't accept that some rootless outsider was commanding the men he'd ruled for 30 years. He didn't sabotage things openly. He acted more subtly. The crew that was supposed to haul stone in the morning ended up in the fields. Aldrich sent them to plow. Because it's spring. Because if they didn't sow now, there would be nothing to eat in winter. He was right. That was the problem. Dan sat on a rock by the gate and counted. 203 people in Ashford. Of those, 47 able-bodied men, 30 more women who could carry and dig, about a dozen teenagers. Half of these people were needed on the construction site, and half in the fields. But they were needed in both places. He went to see Eleanor. Hannah translated. Dan said he needed to set priorities. If Aldrich took people away from the construction site, the wall wouldn't be ready by fall. Eleanor listened. Then she said that Aldrich was right too. Without a harvest, the fortress wouldn't be saved. People who are starving don't fight. Dan thought about it all evening. Then he came to her again in the morning. He proposed a schedule. 3 days a week, the crews would work on the construction site. 3 days in the fields, 1 day off. It was slower than he wanted, but it was a fair compromise. Eleanor agreed. Aldrich heard the decision. He looked at Dan, then at Eleanor. He nodded. It wasn't peace, but it was a truce. Dan had lost momentum and knew it. The past 3 months had been tougher. He sat down at night with a piece of charcoal and a scrap of birch bark and began to recalculate. Every day of construction now cost twice as much. Not a single day wasted. He revised the plan. He removed everything that would be nice to have and left only what was essential. Reinforce the south wall. Build a second tower. Deepen the moat at key points. Remodel the gate. Nothing else for the first phase. At the same time, he was solving the problem with the smithy. Brigitte Stein refused to speak to him. She considered him a swindler who had duped a poor lady with pretty drawings on stones. Dan didn't argue. Instead, he spent 2 days assembling mechanical bellows. The design was simple. A wooden frame, a leather bag from an old saddle, a lever with a counterweight. You press the pedal with your foot and the bellows compress, forcing air into the forge. You release it and the counterweight returns the pedal, rhythmically, continuously. 1 foot instead of 1 hand. The other hand is free to work. He put it together from scraps of wood and bits of leather. Godric helped with the loops. That night, after Brigitte had gone to bed, Dan set up the bellows in the smithy. In the morning, she came in and saw it. Dan was standing outside, waiting. A rumbling came from the smithy, then silence, then the rhythmic hissing of air. She was trying it out. 10 minutes passed. 20. Brigitte came out. She looked at Dan. Her face was red, not from anger, from the fact that she didn't want to admit that this thing worked better than anything she was used to. She said 1 word. Hannah, who was standing nearby, translated. It'll do. Dan took that as a victory. By the middle of the 2nd week, another event occurred. A small, red-haired shadow began following Dan all over the county. Mira Ashford, 14 years old, Eleanor's younger sister. She showed up everywhere. On the wall when Dan was checking the masonry, at the quarry when he was demonstrating cutting techniques, in the smithy when he was discussing the shape of the new wedges with Brigitte. Mira didn't speak English, but she did something else. She watched Dan's drawings and copied them. Exactly. Faster than the adults. Dan noticed this on the 3rd day when he found his sketch of the drainage system from the previous day redrawn on a flat stone by the tower. Every line was in place. The scale was correct. He found Mira. She was sitting on the wall, dangling her feet. Dan showed her the drawing. He pointed to it. She nodded proudly. He took out a piece of charcoal and drew a new sketch. A simple one. A plan for a chicken coop. 4 walls, a sloped roof, a door, perches, a drain for water. He handed the charcoal to her. She took it. She looked at the sketch. Then she drew her own version and added a ventilation window that Dan hadn't included. Dan stared at the drawing. A 14-year-old girl with not a single day of training had intuitively understood that a chicken coop needed ventilation. He nodded, gave her a thumbs up. Mira beamed. From that day on, she became his shadow. Eleanor was against it. She believed her sister had no place on a construction site. Dan explained through Hana that Mira wasn't working, but studying, and that her eyes were worth 10 workers. Eleanor looked at him for a long time. Then she gave her permission. By the end of the second week, the standard blocks were ready, 120 of them, laid in rows against the wall. Identical, even. Godric looked at these rows and shook his head. In 30 years of work, he had never once seen building materials prepared before construction began. Usually, the stones were hewn as they went along, fitted on the spot. Each one was unique. It was familiar, but every joint required fitting, and time slipped through his fingers like water. Now any peasant could pick up a block and place it on the wall. The block fit, always. Dan explained the principle to Godric through Hana. You don't build a wall out of stones, you assemble a wall from identical parts, like a child building a tower out of identical blocks. Godric listened. He nodded. Then he said a phrase in the local language, which Hana translated with a smirk. He says you're turning construction into a child's game, and that it's insulting. But it works. The third week began with the laying of the second tower, the south side. Dan chose the spot carefully. The field of view from here covered the blind spot of the first tower. Together, the two towers saw everything, every approach, every path. They dug the foundation for the tower deep, 2 meters. That was 3 times deeper than the old one. Aldrich stood watching as the peasants hauled dirt out of the pit. He walked over to Dan. Through Hana, he asked why it had to be so deep. Dan answered with a single word that Hana translated. Undermining. Aldrich stood there for a moment. Then, for the first time, he nodded, as if he wasn't just taking note, but agreeing. A deep foundation can't be undermined. Even he understood that. The work went on. The blocks were laid evenly. The crews rotated on schedule. The construction site and the field were no longer fought for people. A rhythm emerged. Dan felt this rhythm like a pulse. When it faltered, something was wrong. When it beat steadily, everything worked. He learned to hear this structure as a living organism. On the 20th day, the walls of the second tower rose to the height of a man. The stone blocks stood level. The mortar of clay and lime held them firmly in place. Dan stood inside the unfinished tower and looked up. The sky was gray. The air smelled of autumn, though autumn was still far off. Somewhere to the north, beyond the horizon, the gray horde was advancing. It devoured one tower after another, closer every day. Dan didn't know how much time he had left. 3 months was Eleanor's estimate, maybe less. He went back to work. On the 25th day, Dan finished the second tower, 8 days from foundation to roof. The locals took 3 months to build such towers. The difference wasn't in magic or secret knowledge. The difference was in standard blocks and a crew system. Every block was the same size. Each one fit into place without any adjustments. 3 crews worked like a chain. The first prepared the mortar. The second handed up the blocks. The third laid them. When a row was finished, the crews moved up. No one waited. No one stood idle. Captain Thorne of the Guard saw the finished tower and fell silent for 3 days. He was a large man with a square face and a scar across his eyebrow. Until that day, he had openly declared that true warriors fought on the battlefield and did not hide behind walls like rats. He said this loudly and often. But the tower that had risen in 8 days impressed him. Not because it was beautiful. It wasn't. Stout. Rough. But it had something the first tower lacked. The embrasures were not placed at random, but by design. Each faced where it needed to. None blocked the view of another. The staircase inside wound clockwise and was just wide enough for 2 people to pass, but not 3. This meant that defenders could run up and down without getting in each other's way, but the attackers couldn't rush in as a crowd. Thorne stood on the top landing of the new tower and looked north. He could see everything. The road, the forest, the hill that had previously hidden the approaches. Now the hill was as plain as day. He went downstairs and approached Dan. He said a long sentence. Hana translated. He says the tower isn't bad for those who don't know how to fight. Dan smiled. it was a compliment. On the 28th day, Dan began work on what he mentally called the kill box. It was a key idea. The point of any defense isn't to keep the enemy out. The enemy will come anyway. The point is to let him in where it's easy to kill him. Dan chose a section of the wall between two towers, 50 paces long. He deliberately left this section lower than the rest of the wall, by half a meter. Any Horde commander would see the weak spot, the low section, a logical place to storm. They would climb right here. And behind this wall, Dan built a second ring, an inner wall, a meter higher than the outer one, with narrow loopholes along its entire length. The space between the two walls was 10 paces wide enough for 30 to 40 men to rush in, not wide enough for them to maneuver. A narrow corridor between the two walls. Archers from the outside through the embrasures. Archers from the towers through the embrasures. Anyone who enters this corridor will come under fire from 3 sides. Dan explained this to Thorn through Hana. Thorn listened. His face slowly changed. Dan drew a diagram on the ground. Arrows, firing sectors, crossfire zones. Thorn crouched down next to the drawing. He stared at it for a long time. Then he poked his finger at a single point. Hana translated. He's asking, what if the enemy breaks through the inner wall as well? Dan nodded. He took out a piece of charcoal. He drew a third element, hinged panels. The floor between the walls would not be solid. The central section was a wooden platform on hinges. If an enemy stepped onto it, a defender would pull a lever. The platform would tip over. The enemy would fall into a pit 2 men high. It was impossible to climb out without a ladder. Thorn looked at the drawing. Then he stood up. Then he sat down. Then he stood up again. He turned to his guards and said something quickly and passionately. Hana translated with a smile. He was telling his men that this skinny southerner thinks about war like a demon, and that he's glad this demon is on their side. From that day on, Thorn became Dan's ally. Not a friend, an ally. That was more valuable. At the same time, Dan was solving another problem. Traps. Not inside the fortress, but outside. The field in front of the wall was flat and open. The Horde would come across this field. Dan wanted the path across this field to become a nightmare. The first trap was simple. Wolf pits. But not random ones, calculated ones. Dan placed them not evenly, but in groups. There were passages between the groups, clear and safe-looking. The Horde would see the pits. The Horde would start to go around them, and they would walk through those very passages that led straight into the tower's firing range. The second trap required some engineering. Dan designed it for 3 nights in a row by the light of an oil lamp. It was a falling slab, a half-ton stone slab mounted on a pole at an angle, held in place by a rope. The rope runs through a system of levers to the tower. One person pulls the lever. The rope is released. The slab falls, and horizontally like a giant palm. Anything standing 3 paces in front of it ceases to stand. Godric looked at the drawing and scratched the back of his head. Then he went to build it. It took him a week. The slab was ready by the end of the 30th day. They tested it on sandbags. 6 bags lined up in a row. Dan pulled the rope. The slab collapsed with a heavy sigh. The bags scattered. One tore and sand spilled onto the ground. The peasants who were watching stepped back 3 paces. Silence. Then Godric said something and everyone laughed. Hana translated. He said that now he knew what to do if his wife yelled at him again. Dan laughed too. It was the first time he had laughed in this world. That evening, he sat on the wall and watched the sunset. Hana climbed up and sat beside him. She said there was a saying in her country. A man who builds a wall protects one village. A man who teaches others to build a wall protects all the villages. Dan didn't answer. He was thinking about something else. He was thinking about how, for the entire month, he hadn't once thought about going back. He hadn't once tried to figure out how he'd ended up here. He hadn't once asked himself if he could go back. And he realized he didn't want to. Not because it was good here. It was hard and dirty and dangerous here. But here, every day, he did something real. Every block that went up on the wall was real. Every trench that was given the right slope was real. Every face of a person who saw his work turn into protection was real. In Seattle, he designed the layout of shelves in a warehouse, and no one ever looked at his work the way Eleanor looked at the completed trench. Hannah waited for an answer. Dan said the saying was a good one. Hannah smiled. Then she asked why he was helping. After all, he wasn't from here. He wasn't obligated. He could have just walked away. Dan thought. Then he answered. Because his whole life he'd been building things that nobody needed. Warehouses, server farms in a game, schematics that nobody ever saw. But here he was building a wall, and behind that wall, people lived. This was the first time his work mattered. Hannah was silent for a long time. Then she said quietly that she understood. She had been translating in 4 languages her whole life. Other people's words, other people's thoughts. Here, for the first time, her translation determined whether the wall would stand or not, whether people live or not. They sat on the wall and were silent. Below, the peasants were heading home. Smoke rose from the chimneys. Somewhere, a child was laughing. A month ago, there had been an estate here, waiting to die. Now there was a construction site. The second month began with rain. It poured non-stop for 3 days straight. Construction ground to a halt. The clay mortar was being washed away. The fresh masonry on the south wall had sagged by 2 fingers' width. Dan stood under the tower's awning, watching the rain and quietly cursing in English. Hannah, standing nearby, refused to translate it. She said some things were better left untranslated. When the rain stopped, Dan inspected the damage. The south wall had held. The foundation they'd deepened had done its job. But 2 sections of the old west wall had cracked. The mortar from the upper courses had been washed away. The stones had shifted. One more downpour like that, and the west wall would lose a meter in height. Dan stood in front of the crack and thought. He couldn't reinforce everything. There weren't enough people. There wasn't enough time. Every day counted, and every choice meant something else would remain unfinished. He made his choice. To dismantle the damaged sections of the western wall and rebuild them. With standard blocks. With deep jointing. That's 2 days of work and 20 blocks from the stockpile. The stock would dwindle, but the wall would stand. He gave the order through Khan. The crews set out. By this point, Dan already knew everyone's names. Every single one. Godric and his 5 carpenters. The stonemason Bran. The red-haired teenager Thomas, who hauled stones faster than the adults. Old Fergus, who mixed the mortar slowly but perfectly. They were his resource, and they were his people. The distinction grew thinner with each passing day. On the 35th day, Dan set to work on the gate. The old gate was made of oak, thick, but the hinges were rusty, and there was only 1 bolt. Dan spent 2 evenings designing the new gate. The result wasn't pretty, but it was functional. Double doors. The outer ones were sheathed with iron strips that Brigida had forged for 3 days. Not 1 bolt, but 3, top, bottom, and center. Behind the gate, he added something no one here had ever seen. A grate. An iron grate slides down grooves in the stone walls of the gate. It's held up by a counterweight. A rope runs to a lever on the wall. 1 person pulls the lever, and the grate drops in a second. Even if the gate is broken down, there's a wall of iron bars behind it. Brigida had been forging this grate for 5 days. Each bar is 2 fingers thick. She worked from dawn to dusk. The mechanical bellows Dan had set up for her allowed her to maintain the heat without an assistant, and she was finally able to use both hands at the same time. Her work speed doubled. She still didn't speak to Dan any more than necessary, but one evening, Dan walked into the smithy to pick up the finished hinges and saw that the anvil was lower. Brigida had cut its base herself, by 3 fingers width, just enough so that the working height suited her stature rather than the standard for men. Dan said nothing, but he took note. She listened, not to his words, but to his principle. Every tool is for the person, not the person for the tool. On the 40th day, the first refugees arrived in Ashford. 7 people, a family. a husband, a wife, and 5 children. They came from the north. Their village had been burned down. They had walked for 6 days. The youngest child was sick. Eleanor took them in. She put them up in an empty house by the wall. Dan looked at this family and saw the future. If word got out, more would come, and with them would come working hands. He was right. Over the next week, 23 more people arrived, then 14 more. By the middle of the second month, Ashford's population had grown to 250. The newcomers were exhausted and frightened, but they knew how to work. Among the refugees was a roofer, 2 shepherds, a midwife, and 1 man who changed a lot. His name was Ren. He was in his 50s, skinny, quiet. He came alone, without a family or belongings, just a leather bag slung over his shoulder. The bag contained tools, chisels, a compass, a folding square. Ren was a stonemason, a true master stonemason with 20 years of experience. He had been working on the construction of Baron Walden's castle, 100 leagues to the north. The castle fell in 2 weeks. The Baron perished. Ren survived because he was in the quarry when the attack began. Dan about him from Godric. He came. Ren was sitting by the wall eating bread. Dan sat down next to him. Through Hana, he asked to see his hands. Ren showed them. The hands of a mason, calluses upon calluses. 3 fingers on his left hand had been hammered off. Dan showed him a standard block. Ren took it, turned it over, tapped it with his knuckles. Then he looked at Dan and spoke a long sentence. Hana translated. He says the block is good, but the mortar is weak. The lime isn't fully slaked. A higher firing temperature is needed. Dan stared at him. In a month and a half, no one had said a word to him about the quality of the mortar. Everyone had just accepted it as is. In 3 minutes, Ren found a problem that Dan had missed. Ren became the second foreman. He took charge of the masonry, while Godric focused on the wooden structures. The division of labor reached a new level. Ren knew things Dan didn't. How to properly mix lime mortar. How to judge the quality of stone by its sound. How to lay a corner block so the wall wouldn't warp. Dan knew the systems, and Ren knew the materials. Together, they worked twice as fast as they did separately. By the 50th day, Dan began work on a project he had been putting off since day 1, a public bathhouse. He understood that this was not a defense. It was not a wall, nor a tower, nor a trap. Aldrich looked at the blueprint and asked through Hana if the stranger had gone mad. People bathe in the river. It had always been that way. Dan replied that people who are freezing and sick cannot build walls. People who cannot sleep because of the cold cannot stand guard. Hot water is not a luxury. It is a resource. Eleanor gave her approval. The design was simple in concept, but complex in detail. A water wheel on the stream outside the wall. The wheel turns a shaft. The shaft, via a system of levers, pumps water from the stream into a reservoir above. The reservoir is made of stone with thick walls. Beneath it is a furnace. The furnace heats the water. Hot water flows down wooden troughs into the bathhouse. Used water drains back into the stream downstream. A closed cycle. The water wheel turns on its own. The furnace needs to be stoked, but there's no need to carry water. Godric built the wheel frame. Ren laid out the reservoir. Brigitte forged the axle and mountings. Mira ran between them and sketched each stage on her stones. Dan coordinated. Construction took 10 days. On the 11th day, the wheel began to turn. Water flowed through the gutters. The furnace hummed. They let the women and children in first. Dan stood outside, leaning against the wall. He heard the splash of water, children's laughter, and then another sound. Quiet. Broken. The old Ashford laundress. Her name was Magda. She was over 60. Her hands were gnarled from the cold water. Her back was bent from years spent on her knees by the river. She walked into the bathhouse. She took off her clothes. She walked to the stone tub and sat down in the hot water. The sound she made was neither a scream nor a word. She was crying. Quietly. Unceasingly. For 40 years, every day, winter and summer, she had washed clothes in the icy river. For 40 years, her hands had ached from the cold, and now she sat in the hot water and couldn't stop the tears. Dan stood outside and listened. Hana stood nearby. He said quietly in English, "You know, in the game, I always built my defenses first, and only then the amenities. Here, I suppose, it should have been the other way around." Hana didn't answer. Dan turned and saw that she was looking at him, not as she usually did, not as a translator looking at an engineer, not as an assistant looking at her boss. Differently. She quickly looked away and said something about it getting late and needing to check tomorrow's work crew schedule. But Dan noticed. That evening, the villagers lit a bonfire in the square. For the first time in a long while, it wasn't a work bonfire, but simply a fire around which people sat. They talked. Someone sang. Magda sat by the fire with wet hair and smiled. Her hands rested on her knees, and for the first time in years, they didn't hurt. Dan sat off to the side by the wall and watched. Eleanor came over and sat down next to him. She said something to him quietly. Dan didn't catch the words, but he understood the tone. She was expressing gratitude. Not for the walls, not for the towers, for the hot water, for the fact that, for the first time in months, her people didn't feel doomed. Dan nodded. Then he looked up at the sky. The stars were unfamiliar, not a single familiar constellation. But the bonfire was warm, and the people were alive, and the walls stood. And somewhere at the edge of the field, in the light of the fire, he noticed movement. A dark figure at the edge of the forest. It stood and watched. Then it vanished. Dan stood up. He walked over to Thorn. He pointed toward the forest. Thorn looked. He sent 2 guards to check it out. They returned half an hour later. No one. But there were tracks on the ground at the edge of the woods. Strange ones. Too wide for a human. Too even for a beast. Thorn looked at the tracks. Then at Dan. They both understood. Scouts. They'd been found. The rain had damaged the western wall, but the deep foundation of the southern wall had held. The gate had been rebuilt with iron plating and a drop grate. The first refugees had arrived, among them the master mason Wren. A public bathhouse with a water wheel had been built. Traces of horde reconnaissance were spotted at the edge of the forest. For the next 3 days, Dan didn't sleep. He sat in the tower by the light of an oil lamp and redrew the defense plan. The horde's reconnaissance meant there was less time left than he had thought. Maybe a month. Maybe 3 weeks. He didn't know exactly how much, but he knew that every day now was worth twice as much. Thorn posted guards on both towers around the clock. 2 men up top during the day, 2 at night. That's 6 of the 9 guards assigned solely to watch. The other 3 patrolled the wall. There weren't enough men. Dan went to Eleanor with a proposal. A militia. Every man between the ages of 15 and 50 must know how to hold a spear and stand on the wall. Not to fight in the field, to stand on the wall. It's easier. The wall does half the work for you. Eleanor agreed. Thorn was against it. He said through Hana that a peasant with a spear is not a warrior, but a target. Dan replied that a peasant on the wall behind a battlements with a spear pointed downward is not a target, but a problem for anyone climbing up. Thorn thought about it. Then he nodded, reluctantly. He began training. 30 men every evening after work. 1 hour. No fencing. 3 movements. Thrust downward, step back, thrust again. The wall protects you. You just stab. At the same time, Dan was solving a problem that had been bothering him since day 1. An alarm system. If an enemy approaches at night, and if the sentry falls asleep or doesn't notice, the fortress will only learn of the attack when the first gray-clad figure climbs over the wall. That's too late. He needed an early warning system. He thought for 2 days. Then he found a solution. Bells on ropes. A simple idea. Thin ropes are stretched between stakes driven into the ground 100 paces from the wall. There are 3 bronze bells on each rope. The ropes are stretched at ankle height, invisible in the dark. Any creature approaching the wall would catch the rope. The bells would ring. The sentry would hear them. The direction would be clear based on which section rang. Brigida cast 30 bells in 2 days. Small, thin, ring-like. Dan hung them himself. 4 lines of rope, each at its own distance from the wall. 100 paces, 70, 50, 30. 4 markers, 4 sounds. The sentry knows not only that someone is coming, but also how far away they are. Thorn tested the system himself. He sent a guard to cross the field at night. The bells rang at the first line. The guard froze. He tried to go around. He triggered the second row. Thorn stood on the tower and heard every sound. He came down and, for the first time in his life, said something to Dan without a snide remark. Hana translated. He says he'll sleep more soundly. On the 55th day, Dan ran into a new problem, the church. In Ashford, there was a small temple of light, a stone building by the western wall, old, leaning. Father Cormac served there, an elderly priest with a kind face and cloudy eyes. He hadn't bothered Dan until that moment, but when Dan began installing the falling slabs in the keel box, Father Cormac came to Eleanor. Hana was present during the conversation and recounted it later. The priest said that mechanisms that kill on their own without human hands are the work of the Dark One. A man must kill his enemy while looking him in the face. So commands the light. A mechanism that kills by a string is cowardice and sin. Eleanor listened patiently. Then she asked Dan what he thought. Dan thought about it. Then, through Hana, he told Father Cormac that the mechanism doesn't kill on its own. A man pulls the string. A man makes the decision. The mechanism only carries it out. Just as a sword carries out the will of the hand. After all, a sword isn't a sin. Father Cormac chewed on that for half the day. Then he came back and said that swords are blessed before battle. Could a rope be blessed? Dan said without a smile that of course it could. Father Cormac blessed the ropes, all of them, every single one. Then he blessed the levers, then the counterweights. Then he walked over to the bathhouse's water wheel and stared at it for a long time. The wheel turned on its own. The water pushed the blades and the wheel turned, and no one touched it. Father Cormac consecrated it 3 times, just in case. The villagers began calling Dan's mechanisms Dan's devils. The name stuck. The water wheel was a water devil. The falling slab was a stone devil. The bells on the ropes were ringing devils. Dan heard this nickname from Hana and snorted, but he didn't argue. People needed to name the incomprehensible to stop fearing it. Let them be devils. On the 58th day, she arrived. Sister Lillian Vane, a young nun in a gray habit. Quiet, pale, gray, attentive eyes. She arrived on a mule with a letter from the abbot of the nearest monastery. The letter was addressed to Father Cormac, but the content concerned Dan. Hana read it later when Eleanor showed it to her. The abbot wrote that rumors had reached him about a stranger in Ashford who was building godless machines. The abbot asked Father Cormac to keep an eye on him and report back, and he sent Sister Lillian to help. To keep an eye on him. Dan understood the situation immediately when Hana explained it. They had sent a spy after him. Polite, educated, quiet, but a spy. Sister Lillian had taken up residence at the temple. She helped Father Cormac with the services. She treated the sick with herbs, and every day she walked around the construction site, taking notes. Dan saw her making notes on a wax tablet. Quick, fine handwriting. She wasn't hiding. She was doing her job openly. It was more honest than covert surveillance, and Dan appreciated that. On the 60th day, he approached her. Hana was standing nearby. Dan said he knew why she was there. Lillian didn't deny it. She said the church was obligated to investigate everything inexplicable. It wasn't hostility, it was duty. Dan nodded. Then he suggested she join him on his rounds. She was surprised. He explained. If she saw everything with her own eyes, her reports would be accurate. If she wrote based on hearsay, the reports would be hostile. It was in his best interest for her to see the truth. Lillian looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. From that day on, she followed Dan like a second shadow. Mira was the first. Mira drew the blueprints. Lillian wrote down the descriptions. Dan joked that he now had his own documentation staff. Hannah translated that as office. Lillian didn't smile, but she wrote it down. On the 62nd day, Dan finished the last element of the first line of defense. The moat had been deepened and widened in key sectors. 2 towers stood, providing a full view. The kill box between them was ready. 3 drop slabs were installed at the approaches. Wolf pits were dug and camouflaged. Bells were hung. The gate was fortified and equipped with a portcullis. The militia trained every evening. Dan stood on the north tower and looked out over the field. Everything was ready as it could possibly be in 2 months. He knew it wasn't enough. He knew every weakness. The western wall was still thinner than it should be. There weren't enough traps. The supply of arrows was limited. There weren't enough men to fully man the walls. But it was 1,000 times better than what he'd seen on the first day. Eleanor stood beside him. She was looking out at the field too. She said something quietly. Hannah translated. She says her father had dreamed of finishing the second tower for 20 years. You did it in 8 days. Dan didn't answer. He was looking at the horizon. Somewhere out there, the horde was advancing. They arrived on the 68th day, in the morning. The sentry in the north tower heard the ringing of bells at the first line of defense, 100 paces. Then, at the second line, 70. He rang the alarm bell. Ashford woke up. Dan ran out of the tower and climbed to the top in 3 minutes. He was gasping for breath. His body was weak. His legs were shaking. But he made it to the top. And he saw them. Gray figures were emerging from the forest. They weren't running. They were walking. At a steady pace. A dense mass. They looked like people, but not quite. Their skin was gray like wet clay. Their eyes were dull. Their movements were synchronized. They didn't shout. They didn't wave weapons. They just walked. It was scarier than any scream. Dan counted. About 20 rows, 10 in each, 200 of them. A reconnaissance unit, not an army, a test. Thorne was already on the wall. His voice boomed across the entire perimeter. The militiamen took their positions, 30 men with spears, 9 guards with crossbows. Ashley Morgan's mercenaries stood apart, 8 swordsmen and 4 archers. Ashley commanded them calmly and concisely. She saw the enemy, and her eyes changed. Cold, professional. Dan stood on the tower, holding a system of signal ropes, 5 ropes, each led to its own sector. Each tug was a command. He'd practiced this with Thor over the past week. 1 tug, get ready. 2 tugs, fire. 3 tugs, fall back to the inner wall. The Greys had reached the first row of wolf pits. The front ones fell through, silently. They simply vanished into the ground. The ones behind didn't stop. They stepped over the bodies of those who had fallen. Dan watched. They weren't afraid of casualties, at all. It wasn't bravery, it was a lack of something fundamental. They didn't value themselves, like units in a game, a resource to be spent. The Greys rounded the second line of pits. They went through the passages, the very passages Dan had left for them. He pulled the first rope, 1 tug. The archers on the towers raised their bows. Ashley's mercenaries drew their bowstrings. The Greys entered the firing zone. Dan pulled twice. The arrows flew. The first volley took down 12 Greys. They fell without a cry. The rest kept moving. The second volley, 9 more. The Greys reached the moat, water, chest deep. They entered the water without slowing down. Dan watched as the gray mass scrambled across the ditch, wet, heavy, slow in the water. The archers fired into the water. Every arrow found its mark because the Greys were packed tightly together and didn't dodge. The ditch became a trap. Not a wall, a trap. It slowed them down just enough for the archers to fire 3 volleys instead of 1. 30 of the gray ones remained in the water. The rest made it to the bank beneath the wall. Wet, but alive. They began to climb. The gray ones crawled up the stone like insects. Their fingers clung to the cracks between the blocks. They were stronger than humans. Dan could see that clearly. One gray was climbing the wall at the speed a normal person walks up a staircase. The militiamen on the wall were working with their spears. Thrust down, retreat, thrust again. Thorn's training was working. The Greys were falling. But they kept coming. The main force moved toward the low section of the wall, toward the kill box. Dan saw it from above. They went where he wanted them to go. The low section, the weak spot, the bait. The Greys climbed over the low wall. 30, 40. They found themselves in the corridor between the outer and inner walls, 10 paces wide, loopholes on 3 sides. Dan pulled the third rope. Archers on the inner wall opened fire through the loopholes. Archers on the towers turned and fired down into the corridor. The Greys were trapped. Arrows flew from 3 sides. Every one found its mark. The corridor turned into a slaughterhouse. The Greys scrambled about. Some tried to climb the inner wall. The militiamen met them with spears. Others turned back. They pressed against those still climbing from the outside. A stampede formed. Dan waited. When enough had gathered in the corridor, he pulled the 4th rope. Godric below released the lever. The wooden floor in the center of the corridor collapsed. 20 Greys fell into the pit. A scream. The first sound they'd made in the entire fight. Not a human scream. A screech. Like iron on stone. The battle lasted 40 minutes. When the last Grey fell, Dan stood on the tower, white as a sheet. His hands were shaking. He was gripping the ropes so tightly that his palms were bleeding from the rough hemp. Below, people were screaming, some out of joy, some out of horror, some out of pain. 2 were wounded, seriously. An arrow had struck a militiaman on the western wall, a guard whom a Grey had grabbed by the leg and dragged down, a broken hip, but alive, both alive. 203 Greys lay on the field and in the corridor and in the moat and in the pits. 203 to 2. No, not 203. Dan counted from the tower. 187 bodies. The rest had fallen into the pits or drowned in the moat, but not a single one got away. Thorn stood on the wall and looked out at the field. His face was gray, not from fear, from understanding. He turned to Dan, said one sentence, Hana translated in a voice that trembled. He says that if it weren't for the walls, everyone would have died today. Dan nodded, climbed down from the tower, sat down by the wall. He threw up. Blueprints are one thing, sandbags are another. Seeing people, even former people, falling, breaking, and grinding in the pit is something else entirely. Hana sat down beside him. She didn't say anything. She just sat there. An hour later, Eleanor arrived. She didn't say anything either. She just put her hand on his shoulder. 2 hours later, Dan stood up. He washed his face. He went to inspect the damage. 3 embrasures on the inner wall were cracked. The folding floor in the keel box is broken. We need a new one. 2 sections of the bell rings are torn off. The moat is littered with bodies. They need to be removed before the water blooms. Work. Always work. That evening, Ashley Morgan came to see him. She sat down across from him, silently. She looked at him for a long time. Then she spoke through Hana. She had fought in 3 wars. She had lost men in each one. Today, out of her 40 fighters, 2 were wounded. 0 killed. 0. In her entire career, not a single commander had designed a defense so that her people would return alive. Dan was silent. Ashley said more. She was with him to the end, wherever that might lead. Dan nodded. He accepted it. That night, he lay on the straw and couldn't sleep. He closed his eyes and saw the Greys in the corridor. He saw how they were thrashing about. He saw the floor collapse beneath them. He had designed a killing machine, and it had worked. Perfectly. And that perfection made him sick. But he knew he would do it again. Because 250 people were sleeping behind the wall, and they were alive. Rumors spread within a week. The small fief of Ashford had repelled an attack by the Horde and lost only 2 wounded. Not a single casualty. 200 Greys destroyed. It was unheard of. Fortresses with garrisons of 500 swordsmen had fallen within 2 weeks. Castles with stone walls 3 meters thick didn't last a month. And a half-ruined fief with peasants and a single tower had been routed by a reconnaissance unit in 40 minutes. The first to arrive was a messenger from Baron Talvar, a neighbor from the southwest. The letter was addressed to Lady Eleanor. Hannah translated it. The Baron expressed his admiration and invited Eleanor to the Council of Houses at the fortress of Hainval. Between the lines, something else was implied. The Baron did not want to see Eleanor, but rather the one behind her, the engineer, the builder, Dan. The merchant arrived second, a fat man with 3 carts. He brought iron, good iron, 4 ingots, and he asked for more silver than Ashford had. Eleanor refused. The merchant left, but he would return, or another would come. Rumors attract trade. Trade attracts resources. Dan understood this chain of events. The third to arrive was a man without a name. He came on foot, travel clothes, an ordinary face. He asked for food and lodging and left at dawn. Lillian saw him leave. She told Dan through Hannah that this man was no refugee. He looked at the walls, counted the towers, and touched the stone. She had seen such eyes in the people of the church who come before an inquisition. Dan took note. He was being watched. He was waiting this. Success attracts attention, and attention attracts those for whom your success is a threat. Dan didn't dwell on it. He was thinking about something else, about the next attack. A 200-man reconnaissance unit was just a feeler. The Horde's main force numbered in the thousands. The first attack had tested Ashford, and Ashford had held. But the Horde learns. He could see it in the Greys' behavior in battle. They don't repeat mistakes. Those who had fallen into the pits in the first wave were now bypassing them. Those who ended up in the kill box were trying to break out rather than push forward. They were adapting right in the heat of battle. Next time, they won't go into the kill box. They'll go around it. Or they'll come with tools for the wall. Or they'll dig. Dan revised the plan. He added a second kill box, on the west side, a different configuration. If the Greys had learned to avoid the first one, the second had to be different. A different corridor width, a different type of trap. Instead of a collapsing floor, he made flood channels, a reservoir on the wall. A lever opens a valve. Hot water from the bath flows down a chute into the corridor. Not boiling water, it wasn't hot enough, but hot water scalds and temporarily blinds. Enough for the archers to do their job. Ren shook his head when he saw the blueprint. He said that pouring water into your own fortress was madness. Dan replied that pouring water into a corridor from which the enemy cannot escape is not madness, but hydraulics. Ren didn't know what to say. They built it in a week. By the 80th day, Ashford had changed. Dan stood on the tower and didn't recognize the place where he was 2.5 months ago. 2 towers. A reinforced wall around the entire perimeter. 2 kill boxes. A deep moat with running water. 4 lines of bells. Wolf pits in front of the wall. 3 falling slabs. A gate with a grate. And that was just the outside. The inside had changed too. The bathhouse was in operation every day. The smithy, with its mechanical bellows, was producing 3 times as much. Ren had figured out how to heat the lime to the right temperature, and the mortar had become stronger. Godric had built a sawmill by the river, a simple one. A water wheel turned the shaft. The shaft, via a crank, moved the saw frame. The log was fed by hand, but the sawing was done mechanically. A single log that 2 people used to saw for a day could now be cut in 3 hours. Mira drew a blueprint of the sawmill so precisely that an exact copy could be built from it. Dan looked at her drawing and told Hannah that in a year, Mira would be drawing better than him. Hannah replied that Mira was already drawing more accurately, just not as fast. As of that day, Ashford's population stood at 311. Refugees were still arriving, not in crowds, 2 or 3 at a time. Each brought a story with them. The village was burned, the castle fell, the baron fled, and the peasants stayed behind. Dan listened to these stories through Hannah and saw a single picture. The north was burning. The horde was marching south, and nothing could stop it. Nothing except walls that work. On the 83rd day, Eleanor accepted Baron Talvar's invitation, the Council of Houses in Hainval. She would take Dan, and Hannah for translation, and 10 of Ashley's mercenaries for protection. Dan didn't want to go. He wanted to build. Every day away from Ashford is a day lost to construction. But Eleanor explained, The Council of Houses is politics. If she doesn't go, they'll consider her weak. If she goes without Dan, the barons won't see the man behind the walls and won't believe her. Dan must go. He had to show up. Dan agreed. Before leaving, he left detailed instructions. To Renu on the masonry, to Godric on the sawmill, to Thor on the patrols. He left the task for Mira, to draw up a drainage plan for the new residential quarter he had envisioned for the refugees. Mira grabbed the coal and birch bark with burning eyes. The journey to Hainval took 4 days. Dan rode in the wagon because he didn't know how to sit on a horse. This drew smirks from Ashley's mercenaries. She rode on horseback herself and looked as if she'd been born in the saddle. Hannah rode too, though not quite as confidently. Eleanor rode ahead, her back straight. She was riding to the Council of Barons. A young woman of 22 with half-ruined flax and a foreigner who builds Danilov devils. She had to look strong. And she did. Hainval was a real castle. Stone walls 4 meters thick, 3 towers, a drawbridge, a garrison of 200 swordsmen. Dan looked at it and saw problems. The walls are thick but high. The center of gravity is too high. A tunnel would bring down the top third. The towers are beautiful, but the battlements are arranged for decoration rather than function. Each has blind spots. There is only one bridge. If it's blocked, the garrison is trapped. He told this to Hannah quietly. She replied that he mustn't dare tell the baron. The council consisted of 4 barons. Talvar, Lord of Hainval, a heavy-set man with intelligent eyes. Martian from the east, an old man with trembling hands and a sharp mind. Corvin from the south, young, arrogant, he looked down on Eleanor. And Darren from the southeast, a woman in her 50s, silent, dangerous. Eleanor introduced Dan as a master fortifier from a distant western land. Dan nodded. He smiled. He said nothing because he couldn't. In 3 months, he had mastered the language at the level of simple phrases. That wasn't enough for the council. Hannah translated. Baron Talvar asked a direct question. Was it true that Ashford had repelled 200 Greys with a peasant force? Eleanor replied that it was true. Talvar asked how. Eleanor nodded to Dan, and Dan began to draw. He drew on the table with charcoal, walls, towers, a moat, a kill box, wolf pits, firing sectors. Hannah translated each element. The 4 barons looked at the drawing. Talvar leaned in closer. Martian squinted and nodded. Corvin grimaced and said it was cowardice. Real warriors don't hide behind cunning walls. Darren was silent and stared at the drawing her hedgehog without looking away. Talvar asked if Dan could build something like this in Hainval. Dan replied through Hannah that he could, but it would take time and resources. Talvar nodded. He said he would think about it. The council ended. On the way back, Eleanor was quiet. Dan asked through Hannah if everything was all right. Eleanor replied that Corvin had called her a peasant lady with a village magician. Dan thought for a moment. Then he said that in a year, Corvin would be asking that magician to build walls for him. Eleanor looked at him, and for the first time on the entire journey, she smiled. Rumors of Ashford's victory spread throughout the region. Dan built a second with a hydraulic trap. Godric assembled a mechanical sawmill. A suspicious observer from the church arrived. Eleanor and Dan attended a council of the 4 barons in Hainval. Baron Talvar is interested in fortifications. Baron Corwin is hostile. They returned to Ashford on the 9th. Dan jumped off the wagon, and the first thing he saw was Mira. She was running toward him across the yard, birch bark in her hands. She unfolded it. A drainage plan, clean, precise, with one detail Dan hadn't asked for. Mira had added rainwater drains from the roofs, gutters that collect rainwater and direct it into a common channel instead of letting it pour onto the ground and wash away the foundations of the houses. Dan looked at the drawing. A 14-year-old girl had single-handedly solved a problem he had been planning to tackle next week. He gave her a thumbs up. Mira beamed and ran off to show her sister. Wren reported on the work. The west wall was 3/4 reinforced. The remaining quarter was waiting for stone. The quarry was working at full capacity. Godric reported on the sawmill. It was running smoothly. The supply of timber had doubled. Thorn reported on the patrols. Quiet. Not a single call in 4 days. But that didn't reassure him. It worried him. After a 200-man reconnaissance unit, the silence meant the horde was preparing something bigger. Dan nodded. He listened. He took it all in. Then he sat down by the wall and thought. The Council of Houses had shown him 2 things. First, the barons are scared. The horde is coming and they don't know how to stop it. Their walls were built by the old rules, and the Greys cut through them like a knife through butter. Second, the barons don't trust each other. Each sits in his own castle and waiting for their neighbor to fall first. While the neighbor is being devoured, they can prepare. It was the strategy of the doomed. Dan understood that Ashford alone could not withstand a major siege. 200 Greys is one thing, 3,000 is another. He needs allies. He needs a network of fortresses. But that's a year-long task, and right now, he needed to survive the next 2 weeks. He was wrong. He didn't have 2 weeks. He had 3 days. On the 93rd day, a sentry sounded the alarm. All 4 lines of bells rang out simultaneously. Not from one side, from all sides. Dan flew up to the tower and froze. The field in front of Ashford was gray. Not from fog, from bodies. The Greys stood in a ring around the fortress, tight rows. Dan counted. The rows stretched into the distance. 10 rows, 20. He counted the columns, lost count, started over. Hannah climbed up beside him. She turned pale. Dan told her the number. About 3,000, maybe more. Hannah relayed this to Eleanor, who was standing below by the stairs. Eleanor didn't move. Only her fingers tightened on the railing until her knuckles turned white. Thorn was already on the wall. He was positioning the men. The militiamen took their positions. Ashley's mercenaries spread out across the sectors. Brigida carried the last batch of arrowheads out of the smithy. 120 of them. She had been forging them all night because she sensed it was coming soon. Wren stood by the west wall, inspecting every seam. Godric was securing the last planks on the restored keel. Mira stood by the tower door with an armful of birch bark scrolls. She wasn't crying. She wasn't trembling. She held the blueprints and waited. Dan looked at her, then at Eleanor, then at the gray ring surrounding the fortress. 3,000. 311 people inside. Of those, about 100 were fit for battle. The rest were women, children, old people. He took the signal ropes, 5 familiar ones and 3 new ones he'd added over the last month. 8 commands, 8 sectors. He was the conductor, and his orchestra consisted of stone and iron and wood and the people who believed in him. The Greys didn't attack right away. They stood there. An hour, 2. Dan understood. They were studying, looking at the walls, at the towers, at the moat. They saw that this fortress was unlike the ones they had taken before. And they were thinking. Someone was thinking for them. By the 3rd hour, they moved. Not all at once, in 3 columns, north, west, south. They left the eastern side empty. Dan saw this and realized it was a trap. The empty eastern side was an invitation to flee. If the defenders ran, they would run east, into the open field, where they would be caught. Dan tugged on the rope of the eastern sector. 1 tug. Get ready. Thorn looked at him in surprise. Dan pointed to the empty eastern field. Then he ran the edge of his palm across his throat. A trap. Thorn understood. He sent 10 additional militiamen to the eastern wall. The columns moved toward the wall. The wolf pits claimed the first ones. But the Greys were learning. The front ranks moved slowly. They were probing the ground, finding the pits, going around them. They were learning between battles. Someone had passed on information about the first attack. Someone was analyzing it. Dan watched, and something clicked in his head. They weren't just learning. They were being controlled. Not instinct, not a pack. Command. The northern column reached the ditch, and didn't wade into the water. They stopped. The front ranks pulled bundles of brush from behind their backs. They began throwing them into the ditch, to fill it in. Dan watched and felt a chill in his stomach. They had adapted to the ditch. Last time, the ditch had slowed them down and they had perished in the water. This time, they had brought planks with them. 10 minutes later, the section of the ditch in front of the northern column was piled high with brushwood. The Greys climbed over it, dry, fast. The archers fired, but 3,000 is not 200. For every one killed, another took his place. The arrows were running out. Brigida had forged 120 arrowheads. They had 400 arrows, against 3,000. Dan counted in his head. 400 arrows. Every third one hits. 130 dead. Another 2,870 alive. He tugged the ropes. The archers switched their aim to the western column, which had approached the kill box. The western column behaved differently. They didn't climb over the low section. They walked past it, right past it. They knew about the kill box. Dan clenched his teeth. Someone had told them. Or they'd found bodies in the corridor and figured it out. They bypassed the trap and struck the wall to the left, the section that Wren hadn't had time to reinforce. The last quarter of the western wall, the weakest spot. Dan relayed the orders. Thorne led 20 militiamen west. Ashley sent her mercenaries there as well. A battle on the wall. The Greys were climbing the stone. The militiamen stabbed downward. Spears snapped. People grabbed stones and hurled them. Brigida climbed onto the wall with a hammer. She struck the Greys who were scaling the edge. One blow, one Grey. She was huge and terrifying, and the hammer in her hands weighed as little as a feather. 3 hours. 4. The battle didn't stop. The Greys rolled in like waves. They retreated. They rolled again. They were rotating. The tired ones went back. The fresh ones moved forward. The defenders had no relief. The same people stood on the wall hour after hour. By the 5th hour, Dan gave the order that was hardest for him to give. He pulled the rope on the second kill box, the western one. The tank opened. Hot water gushed into the corridor. But there weren't only Greys in the corridor. There was a militiaman, a young guy. He'd been pulled off the wall and was fighting below. The water scalded everyone. They pulled the guy out, scorched, alive. But Dan knew he'd given an order that could have killed him. Night. The Greys hadn't retreated. They stood around the fortress in the darkness. Torches on the walls illuminated the nearest rows. Beyond that, darkness and silence, and occasionally a sound, that grinding, iron against stone. Dan wasn't sleeping. No one was sleeping. He walked along the wall, checking every sector. There were 11 wounded, not a single casualty yet. But the men were exhausted. The second day. The Greys attacked at dawn, again in 3 columns. But now they'd brought ladders, rough ones, made from tree trunks, but functional. They'd learned. In a single night, they'd cut down trees and fashioned ladders. Dan watched from the tower and knew his time was up. If the Greys started climbing over the wall using the ladders, the battle would turn into hand-to-hand combat. And in hand-to-hand combat, 300 peasants against 3,000 Greys meant certain death. He made a decision. He fled the tower. He ran to the sawmill. Godric was there. Dan pointed to the saw frame, to the beams, to the stock of lumber, and he explained what he wanted with gestures and fragments of local words. Godric understood in a minute. 2 hours later, wooden frames appeared on the wall, vertical ones, with crossbars. They jutted out over the wall like the teeth of a comb. The Greys' ladders rested against these frames and didn't reach the top of the wall. The Greys climbed the ladders and ran into the wooden beams. They couldn't get over. And the militiamen speared them through the gaps between the beams. It was ugly, rough, temporary, but it worked. Day 3, the 4th, the 5th. The Greys didn't leave. They had lost hundreds but kept pressing forward. The arrows ran out on the 3rd day. Brigida forged arrowheads day and night. Mira gathered the Greys' arrows from the field through a small hole in the wall that Dan had forbidden her to use. She didn't listen. She brought back 20 arrows per sortie. Eleanor found out and flew into a rage. But the arrows were needed. Lillian treated the wounded in the chapel. Her herbs and bandages kept people on their feet. She hadn't slept for 3 days, and her face was as gray as those behind the wall. But her hands didn't tremble. On the 6th day, the Greys began digging. Dan saw it from the tower. They were digging a tunnel under the south wall, where the foundation was deep. They didn't know it was deep. They dug, and at a depth of 2 meters, they hit rock. They stopped. They moved to the west wall. They dug there. The foundation of the west wall was shallower. Dan knew. He hadn't made it in time. Ren hadn't made it in time. A quarter of the wall stood on a shallow foundation. The tunnel would reach the foundation in 2 days. Dan called a meeting. Eleanor, Thorne, Ren, Godric, Ashley. Hannah translated. Dan said the west wall would fall in 2 days if the tunnel wasn't stopped. Thorne suggested a sortie. Ashley said her men were ready. Dan shook his head. A sortie against 3,000 was suicide. Instead, he proposed something else. A counter-tunnel. Dig from their side toward the Greys' tunnel. When the tunnels met, flood the enemies with water from the moat. Ren said it was possible. He knew the ground. He could hear where the Greys were digging by the vibrations in the wall. 20 men dug the counter-tunnel all night. Ren was in charge. Dan calculated the direction. At dawn on the 7th day, the tunnels met. Ren broke through the final wall and jumped back. Godric opened the sluice gate from the moat. Water gushed into the tunnel. A screech came from the enemy tunnel. Then a gurgling sound. Then silence. The tunnel was flooded. The Greys lost their diggers and 2 days' work. Dan stood at the entrance to the counter-tunnel, wet and dirty. Ren stood beside him. The old mason put his hand on his shoulder and spoke briefly. Hannah translated. He says, "Good work." The siege continued. Day 8, the 9th, the 10th. People were dropping from exhaustion. Eleanor walked along the wall and handed out bread personally, to everyone. She knew every name, every face. She wasn't a warrior, but she was Lady Ashford, and the people saw her on the wall and didn't give up because she didn't give up. On the 11th day, the Greys retreated. Not immediately. First the rear ranks turned, then the middle ones, then the front ones. They were heading north, slowly, in an orderly fashion, just as they had come. Dan stood on the tower and watched. He couldn't believe it. An hour, 2. The field was emptying. By evening, the last Grey had vanished into the forest. Silence. Absolute silence. Then someone on the wall shouted, and the shout was taken up. People were shouting and hugging and crying. 11 days, 3,000 Greys. Ashford had held out. Casualties. Dan climbed down and counted. 4 dead. The stonemason Bran, a militiaman named Lauren, the guard Victor, and old Fergus, who had been mixing mortar. He had gone out onto the wall on the last day with a shovel and taken a blow to the chest. 23 wounded, 7 of them seriously. Dan stood before the bodies. 4 people he knew by name. 4 people who had built this wall, and whom this wall had not saved. Eleanor stood beside him. She raised her hand and placed her palm on his shoulder, and for the first time, she didn't say, "Mr. Carter," just Dan. After the siege, Dan didn't leave the tower for 2 days. He sat at the table that Ren had moved into his room and sketched. Not walls, not towers. He sketched faces. Bran, Lauren, Victor, Fergus. 4 faces he remembered. 4 faces he hadn't been able to save. He didn't know how to draw people. The faces came out crooked, but he drew. Hannah came in twice. She brought food. She set it on the table. She left in silence. Eleanor came in once. She stood in the doorway. She looked at the drawings. She said nothing. She left. On the 3rd day, Brigida came. She walked in without knocking. She looked at Dan. She looked at the crooked faces on the birch bark. Then she said a long sentence. By this time, Dan understood the local language well enough to catch the gist of it. She said her husband had died 3 years ago when a wall collapsed. A wall built according to the old rules. A shallow foundation. Crooked masonry. A stone fell and killed him. If the wall had been built the way Dan builds them, her husband would still be alive. 4 had died. But 250 were alive. And if he was going to sit there feeling sorry for himself, he should at least not take up the room, because the wounded needed space. Dan looked at her. He stood up. He put away the drawings. He stepped out into the light. Ashford looked exhausted after the siege, but alive. The walls were still standing, battered in places, cracked in others. The western wall had lost its top course for a stretch of 20 paces. The gate was holding, but one hinge had snapped. The moat was filled with brushwood on the northern side. It needed to be cleared. The field in front of the fortress was littered with the bodies of the Greys. They had to be removed and burned before the infection set in. Work. Always work. Dan started with the bodies. He organized a crew from those who could stand on their feet. The bodies were dragged out to the field to the west and burned. The fires burned for 3 days. The stench was so bad that Meyer was forbidden from going outside the walls. She didn't listen, as usual. At the same time, Dan was repairing the damage. The moat was cleared in 2 days. Godric repaired the keelbox decking. Wren repaired the western wall. Brigitte forged new hinges for the gate. On the 100th day, a messenger from Baron Talvar arrived in Ashford. The letter was brief. Talvar had seen it. Scouts had reported the 11-day siege to him. He wanted the same for Hainval. He was offering a contract. Stone, iron, 200 workers, silver. In exchange for Dan building him a fortress to Ashford's standards. Eleanor read the letter. She looked at Dan. Dan said, through Hannah, that this was just the beginning. If Talvar gets walls, the others will want them too. But he can't leave Ashford right now. The fortress is damaged. It needs repairs. It needs to be expanded. 300 people won't fit within walls designed for 200. Eleanor nodded. She dictated the reply. Dan would arrive in Hainval in 2 months, on the condition that Talvar send iron and 50 workers to Ashford right away, as an advance. Talvar agreed. A week later, the wagons arrived. Iron, tools, and 50 men. Strong, healthy. Among them were 2 masons and 1 carpenter. Dan looked at this wealth and smiled for the first time in 100 days. With new people and new resources, he began what he had planned long ago, the technical quarter, an area within the expanded walls entirely dedicated to production. First, he rebuilt the smithy. He didn't repair it, he rebuilt it from scratch. A new building, stone walls, a high ceiling for ventilation, 2 forges instead of 1, mechanical bellows on both, an anvil at the right height, a separate corner for fine work with a bench and a table, light streaming through a wide window on the north side so it wouldn't be blinding. Brigitte walked into the new smithy and stopped at the threshold. She stood there for a long time. Dan waited outside. She walked around every corner. She touched the anvil. She checked the bellows. She sat down on the bench in the corner for fine work. The bench was the right height. The table was the right width. The tools were laid out so her right hand could reach them without looking. Everything was made for her, not for an average blacksmith, for her height, for her grip, for her habits, which Dan had observed for 3 months. Brigitte came out. She looked at Dan. Her face was strange, not angry, not grateful, confused. She said one sentence. Dan understood without translation. "Why did you do this?" He replied in broken local dialect, "Because you're the best blacksmith I've ever seen, and the best blacksmith deserves the best forge." Brigitte stood there. Then she turned and walked into the forge. The door closed. A minute later, the sound of a hammer striking an anvil came from inside, steady, strong, fast. She was working. But that evening, Hannah told Dan she'd seen Brigitte by the stream. She was sitting on a rock, working with her hands. Hannah got closer. Brigitte was making a ring, a thin one, with a small curl. Just like that, for beauty's sake, for the first time in 5 years. The second building in the industrial quarter was the new sawmill, larger, with 2 saw frames, with a shed for drying boards. Godric oversaw the construction and beamed like a polished copper coin. The third was the mill. Until then, grain had been ground by hand. The women ground it with stone millstones for hours on end. Dan installed a water wheel. The millstones turned on their own. The flour came out finer and faster. The women who had ground grain their whole lives stood and watched the spinning millstones. One of them, old Magda, the very same laundress from the bathhouse, approached Dan and said something. Hana translated, and her voice faltered. Magda says her mother ground grain by hand until the day she died. 20 years. Her hands were like stone. If a mill like this had existed back then, her mother would have lived longer. Dan nodded. He said nothing. But he remembered. Every machine he built was for someone specific. Not abstract. Specific. At the same time, he was working on housing. The refugees were still living in tents and shacks. Winter was approaching. Dan designed a standard house, like a standard apartment block, only bigger. A stone foundation, wooden walls made of lumber from the sawmill, a sloped roof for water runoff. One room, a hearth with a chimney. A chimney, that was the main thing. Local houses didn't have chimneys. Smoke escaped through a hole in the roof or didn't escape at all. People breathed in smoke all winter. They coughed. They got sick. Children died of pneumonia. The chimney changed everything. Dan calculated the draft, the height of the pipe, the diameter, the slope. Wren laid out the first chimney made of bricks that were fired right there in the new kiln. The first house was ready in 6 days. A standard one. It could be replicated. 20 crews, 20 houses, 3 weeks. The first family moved into their home on the evening of the 110th day. A man, a woman, 3 children. Refugees from the north. They had lived in a tent for 2 months. The man lit the hearth. Smoke rose up the chimney. The room was clean, warm, dry. The children sat on the floor by the fire. The youngest stopped coughing after 3 days. The man came to Dan, stood in front of him, said a phrase that Dan understood without translation, because by this time he already spoke the local language passably. "Mr. Carter, my children aren't coughing." Dan nodded. He turned away, because he didn't want them to see his face. That evening he sat alone on the wall. He looked at the stars, foreign constellations he never learned. Somewhere below, in the new houses, lights were on. Smoke rose from the chimneys in steady columns. The children weren't coughing. The walls stood. And for the first time in 110 days, Dan Carter thought that maybe this was what had brought him here. Not fortresses, not walls, not traps. Chimneys. After 2 days of silence, Dan returned to work. Baron Talvar offered a construction contract. Eleanor bargained for iron and workers as an advance. Dan built a technical quarter with a new forge for Brigida and a water-powered mill. Construction began on standard houses with chimneys. The first refugee families moved into warm housing. On the 120th day, Dan left for Heinval. Hana and 20 of Ashley's mercenaries traveled with him. Ashley herself remained in Ashford to command the defenses. Eleanor stayed behind to manage the fief. Before his departure, she summoned Dan to her office, the very same office that Dan had remodeled 2 months earlier. The desk stood by the window. The entire village was visible through the window. Eleanor sat at the desk, the light falling on her hands. She said he had to come back. Not because Ashford needed an engineer, because Ashford needed him. Dan nodded. He promised. The journey to Heinval took 3 days. Baron Talvar met them personally. He looked different than he had at the Council of Houses. Not like the lord of the castle, but like a man whose house was on fire. His scouts reported that the horde had turned southwest, straight toward Heinval. 4 months, maybe 5. Talvar wanted walls, fast. Dan surveyed Heinval in 2 days. Everything he'd seen on his first visit was confirmed. The walls were thick but vulnerable to undermining. The towers were decorative. Dead zones were everywhere. The moat was shallow and stagnant. But Heinval had resources that Ashford didn't. 200 workers, a quarry 20 minutes away, a smithy with 3 blacksmiths, a forest nearby, silver for hiring. Dan drew up a plan in 3 nights. He didn't rebuild Heinval from scratch. That would have taken a year. Instead, he reinforced the weak spots. He deepened the foundations in critical sectors. He added 2 new towers with properly positioned battlements. He built a kill box at the main gate. He installed a bell system. He redesigned the moat with running water. And he trained Talvar's men in the brigade system, standard block, conveyor belt, brigades of 8. Everything he had worked out in Ashford, but faster, because now he had trained people. He brought 4 foremen with him from Ashford. They became foremen. They knew the system. They taught the locals. A month later, Hainval was unrecognizable. Talvar walked along the new walls and shook his head. He told Dan through Hana that his grandfather had been building this castle for 20 years. Dan had rebuilt it in 30 days. Dan replied that he hadn't rebuilt it, but repaired it. The difference is that repair is faster, but rebuilding is better. But there's no time for better. While Dan was working in Hainval, 2 things happened. First, a man came to him, not from Talvar, on his own. His name was Gareth, a young stonemason, 20 years old. He worked in the crew on the south wall, and he asked questions. Not stupid questions like why so deep, smart ones, like why the angle of the embrasure is exactly that and not 2 fingers steeper. Dan explained. Field of fire. If it's steeper, the archer sees the wall instead of the field. Gareth nodded. The next day he came with a sketch. He'd drawn a loophole with a variable angle. Wider at the bottom, narrower at the top. An archer could shoot both down toward the wall and out into the field with a single loophole. Dan looked at the sketch. He saw a mistake in it. The narrow part was too thin. The stone would crack. But the idea was right. He pointed out the mistake to Gareth. Gareth fixed it in a minute. Dan suggested he go to Ashford to study. Gareth agreed without hesitation. The second thing was worse. On the 20th day of work in Hainval, Lillian approached Dan. She arrived quietly, without warning. Her face was paler than usual. She asked Hana to step outside. Then she spoke to Dan in the local dialect. By this point, he understood almost everything. She spoke slowly and clearly. Her uncle, Archbishop Leonard Wayne. He had begun an inquiry, an official one, regarding a case of heresy in the Ashford fiefdom. The subject of the inquiry, mechanisms operating without human hands, water wheels, falling slabs, self-filling moats. According to the Church, this contradicts the teaching of the light, which states that all work is prayer, and that replacing human labor with mechanical means substitutes prayer with emptiness. Dan listened. Lillian continued. The Archbishop had sent investigators to Ashford, 3 of them. They would arrive in a week. They would be looking for evidence of Dan's connection to the Dark One, and they would find what they were looking for because they always do. Dan asked why she was telling him this. Lillian was silent for a long time. Then she said she had been sent to watch him. She had watched him for 3 months. She had seen everything he did, and she hadn't found a single trace of the Dark One. She had found a man who builds chimneys so children don't cough. Her faith teaches that a person's deeds speak louder than words. Dan's deeds spoke clearly. And if her order couldn't see that, then the order was blind. Dan looked at her, a quiet, pale nun who had just betrayed her order for the sake of the truth. He said thank you. She shook her head, said there was no need to thank her. She did it not for him, but for herself, because she could no longer lie in her reports. Dan returned to Ashford 4 days later, sooner than he had planned. The investigators were already there. 3 men in gray robes, cold eyes, slender hands. They walked around Ashford and took notes. They looked at the water wheel. They touched the mechanical bellows. They stood in front of the falling slab and whispered to each other. Eleanor held her ground. She received them with the politeness of a hostess and steel in her voice. Aldrich unexpectedly took her side. The old Castellan, who 3 months ago had called Dan a charlatan, was now telling the investigators that Carter's mechanisms had saved Ashford, and that if the church wanted to remove them, it should send an army to protect the fief in their place. Dan stood to the side and remained silent. Hana whispered to him what the interrogators were saying among themselves. They weren't looking for the truth. They were building a case. Anything that didn't fit their conclusion, they ignored. Everything that did fit, they wrote down twice. Dan saw this and understood that logic was powerless here. This wasn't a trial. It was politics. Archbishop Leonard wanted him gone. Not because he believed in heresy, because Dan had shown people that it was possible to live without the church, that walls offered better protection than prayers, that a water wheel provided a more reliable livelihood than blessings. That was more dangerous than any heresy. The investigators left 5 days later. They took with them the scrolls containing the records and a promise that the decision would be announced at the fall council. This gave Dan 3 months. 3 months before the church declared him a heretic. Or didn't. It depended on what happened between now and the council. Winter came early. On the 150th day, the first snow fell on the walls of Ashford. Dan stood on the tower and looked out at the white expanse. Beautiful, quiet, deadly. Winter meant the horde would slow down. The Greys moved poorly through deep snow. But winter also meant construction would stop. Mortar doesn't set in the cold. Stone becomes brittle. People were freezing and getting sick. Dan switched to interior work, things that could be done under a roof. Brigitte was forging, 12 hours a day. The new forge allowed her to work in warmth and comfort. She made arrowheads, hinges, staples, tools, and something new. Dan brought her a blueprint, a crossbow bolt, a mechanism that allowed the crossbow to be reloaded with one hand, a lever with a latch. He pressed it. The bowstring tightened. He loaded the bolt. Done. A standard crossbow required 2 hands and a foot brace. On the battlefield, that was slow and cumbersome. With the bolt mechanism, the rate of fire doubled. Brigitte looked at the blueprint, then at Dan. Then she said the mechanism was too complex for field conditions. 3 moving parts. Each one could jam in the cold. Dan thought about it. She was right. He simplified it. 2 moving parts. Brigitte simplified it even further. 1 moving part and a clever bend in the lever. The result worked better than the original. Dan watched as she refined it and realized that Brigitte wasn't just a blacksmith. She was an engineer. Not a trained one, a natural. She thinks with her hands, and her hands think better than his head. He told her that. She grumbled that he shouldn't flatter her and went back to forging. But she made the bolt in 3 days, 15 of them. Thorne handed them out to the best marksman. The firing rate from the wall doubled. At the same time, Dan was building what he had promised and put off, a library, for Hannah. The top floor of the North Tower, a small room, but well-designed. 3 windows for light from different sides. Ventilation through stone channels in the walls so moisture wouldn't accumulate and the scrolls wouldn't get moldy. Slanted tables for working with large maps, shelves along the walls. A storage system Dan had borrowed from his experience in warehouse logistics. Each scroll in its own compartment. Each compartment numbered. Hannah went upstairs when everything was ready. She stood in the doorway and didn't move. Dan stood behind her and waited. She walked around the room. She touched the tables. She ran her hand along the shelves. She stopped by the window. All of Ashford was visible outside the window. Smoke from the chimneys, people on the streets, the walls. She turned to Dan. Her eyes were shining. She said that in her whole life, in embassies, in other people's palaces, in caravanserais, she had never had a place of her own. She had always been a guest, a translator, an ambassador's daughter, a stranger. And now she had a room with shelves and numbers and a table by the window, and it was hers. Dan said that if she didn't like the arrangement of the shelves, he could rearrange them. Hannah laughed, and then she cried. And then she laughed again, and said the shelves were perfect. Winter dragged on. Dan made use of every day. He taught. Every evening people gathered in the tower. Godric, Wren, Gareth, who had come from Hainval, Mira, and new faces. 2 from the masonry crew, a carpenter among the refugees, Godric's wife, who turned out to be the best bookkeeper in Ashford. Dan taught them what he knew. Not specific blueprints, but principles. Standardization, modularity, workflows, the assembly line. Every evening he drew on the blackboard with charcoal and explained. Hannah translated the difficult parts. Mira took notes. Lillian sat in the corner and listened. She was still taking notes, but Dan knew those notes weren't going to the church. She was writing them down for herself. One evening after class, she stayed behind. Everyone had left. Dan was erasing the drawings from the board. Lillian said that the teachings of the light state that knowledge belongs to God and that humans merely preserve it. Yet he imparts knowledge to anyone who comes. That contradicts the teachings. Dan replied that knowledge that lies in a single mind dies with that mind. He tapped his temple. If the Greys kill him tomorrow, everything he knows will vanish. But if he taught 20 people, then the knowledge lives on in 20 minds. That's not heresy, it's insurance. Lillian was silent. Then she said that in her order, there are books that lay people are forbidden to read. She had always accepted this as wisdom. Now she thinks it's fear. Fear that lay people will read them and realize that knowledge isn't divine, but simply useful. Dan looked at her. He said she was smarter than she thought. Lillian replied that it wasn't a compliment, but a problem. Because a smart nun who doubts the order is a nun without a home. Dan said a home could be built. He knows how. Lillian looked at him for a long time. Then she stood up and left. But at the threshold, she turned around and said quietly, she said that the acoustics in the chapel had improved after he rebuilt the south wall. Her voice now sounded the way she had always wanted it to, and she knew he had done it on purpose. Dan didn't answer, because she was right. On the 170th day, news arrived. Bad news. Baron Corvin, that very same arrogant young baron from the Council of Houses, declared Dan a charlatan and a heretic, publicly, in the town square of his city. He said that Ashford was leading people by the nose, that there had been no siege, that Carter's mechanisms were tricks, and that true protection was a sword and prayer. Eleanor learned of this from a merchant. She was furious. Quietly, coldly. She sat at the desk in her study, and her hands did not tremble. They were absolutely still. It was more terrifying than a tremor. Dan said that Corwin didn't matter. What mattered was what stood behind him. Corwin wouldn't have been shouting about heresy without support. The church. Archbishop Leonard. He didn't wait for the council. He started the campaign early, through Corwin, through rumors, through fear. Dan understood the logic. If by the time of the council people already considered him a heretic, the council would merely confirm what everyone already knew. He had to act. Not wait. Act. He wrote a letter to Baron Talvar. Hannah helped with the wording. The letter was simple. Dan offered Talvar and anyone else who wished to send people to Ashford for training, free of charge. Any baron could send masons and carpenters, and they would learn to build according to Ashford's standards. There was only one condition. The apprentices must bring their own stone or iron, payment in kind. Talvar replied a week later. He was sending 10 men. Baroness Darren, that silent woman from the council, sent a reply even faster. 15 men and 20 iron ingots. Martian sent 5, and an apology that he couldn't send more. Corvin sent no one. But Dan didn't need him anyway. By the 180th day, there were 30 students from 3 counties in Ashford. They studied, they built, they mastered the standard block and the brigade system. The Ashford Standard ceased to be just a word. It became a school. Spring arrived with mud and hope. The snow melted, the ground turned to slush, and on the 200th day, what Dan had been planning all winter began. Expansion. Ashford had outgrown its walls. 412 people lived within a perimeter designed for 200. Dan sketched out a new perimeter, an outer ring of walls, twice as wide as the old one, with 4 towers instead of 2, with 3 gates instead of 1, with a system of internal partitions that divided the fortress into sectors. If the enemy broke through the outer wall, they would find themselves not inside the fortress, but inside the next kill box. The entire fortress was a kill box inside a kill box inside a kill box. Wren looked at the master plan and said it looked like an onion. Dan said an onion was the perfect fortress. Each layer protects the next. Work was in full swing. 50 Talvar workers, 30 apprentices, local crews, a total of over 150 people on the construction site. Standard blocks, a foreman system, an assembly line. The walls were rising before our eyes. 1 meter a day, 2. Wren oversaw the masonry. Godric supervised the carpentry. Gareth led the team of apprentices and did it better than some masters twice his age. Mira was drafting. She no longer copied Dan's blueprints. She was making her own. Drainage for the new quarter. Roof drainage. A system of wells for the outer ring. Dan checked each one and found fewer and fewer mistakes. On the 210th day, a messenger arrived. Not from the barons, from Archbishop Leonard. The letter was addressed to Lady Eleanor, official, with the church's seal. Hannah read it aloud. Dan listened. The Archbishop demanded the surrender of Dan Carter for interrogation on charges of heresy and the use of forbidden knowledge. The deadline was 10 days. If Lady Ashford refused, the church would excommunicate the fief from the light. Excommunication meant that no priest would conduct a service in Ashford. Not a single baptism. Not a single funeral. Not a single marriage blessing. For the peasants, this was worse than the horde. Eleanor read the letter with a stony face. Then she placed it on the table. Then she looked at Dan. He saw in her eyes the question she did not ask aloud. What to do? Dan thought about it for a day. Then he called a meeting. Everyone. Eleanor, Thorne, Wren, Godric, Brigida, Ashley, Hannah, Lillian, Aldrich, even Mira sat in the corner and listened. Dan spoke in the local language, slowly, with mistakes, but they understood him. He said he wouldn't go to the Archbishop, because this wasn't an interrogation, but an execution. He said that excommunication was painful, but not fatal, and the horde was fatal. A choice between an offended priest and 3,000 greys is no choice. Aldrich stood up. The old Castellan, who was over 60, stood before everyone and said that a year ago he had wanted to expel Dan. He was wrong. This man had given Ashford walls and homes and warmth and a mill and a bathhouse. The church had given none of that. If the church wanted to take away the one who protected his people, then the church could go to the Dark One. Silence. Aldrich sat down. His face was red. He had just publicly told the church to go to hell. He understood what he had done. Thorne nodded. Brigida slammed her fist on the table and said one word. Agreed. Ashley said that her sword stood between Dan and anyone who came for him. Lillian was silent. She sat there pale, clenching her hands. Then she stood up. She said she would write a letter to her uncle, a personal one. She would tell him the truth, everything she had seen, everything she had recorded over the past 6 months. If he read it and came anyway, she would stand in front of the cathedral and testify. Against him. Against the order. For the truth. Dan looked at her. A small, pale nun who was ready to burn her life for the sake of a man who had built her a chapel with the right acoustics. Eleanor sent a reply to the Archbishop. Brief. Len Ashford rejects the demand. Master Carter is under Lady Ashford's protection. Dan watched as Eleanor sealed the letter. Her hand did not tremble. Her voice did not falter. She was the Baron's daughter, and she was defending her man. 10 days passed. The excommunication was announced. Father Cormac received orders to leave Ashford. The old priest stood on the threshold of his church and wept. He did not want to leave. His flock was here. His church was here. Lillian approached him and said quietly that he could stay, not as a priest, as a healer. He knew herbs just as well as she did. Father Cormac stayed. He took off his cassock. He put on a simple shirt. He continued to heal people. But the church felt empty, and the villagers could sense it. It was hard. Dan understood that the wound of excommunication would fester if left untreated. He found a cure not in words, but in stone. On the 220th day, when the outer ring of walls was half finished, he completed a small project he had been working on in secret. A chapel. Not for the church, for Lillian, for the people. A stone building within the new perimeter. Small, simple, but the acoustics. Dan calculated the shape of the walls so that the voice of a person standing at the altar would carry to every corner. Pure, clear, without echo or distortion. The window on the east wall was positioned so that the morning light fell precisely on the altar stone, not on the floor, not on the wall, on the stone, every morning. Lillian entered the chapel at dawn. Dan stood outside. He heard her begin to sing, softly at first, then louder. Her voice filled the space and sounded just as she had always dreamed. She sang for 10 minutes. Then she came out. Her eyes were red, her face was wet. She looked at Dan and said that he had built a house of God better than any abbot, without the church's permission, without a blessing, simply because it was important to him that her voice sounded right. Dan said that acoustics is mathematics. Lillian said that mathematics is also a miracle, and she smiled for the first time. In the spring, the expansion of Ashford began with an outer ring of walls. Archbishop Leonard demanded Dan's extradition under threat of excommunication. The council unanimously refused. Lillian promised to testify against her uncle. Ashford was excommunicated from the church. Dan built an independent chapel with perfect acoustics for Lillian. On the 230th day, a messenger arrived from Hainval. Baron Talvar reported that the horde had turned, not to the southwest, to the south, straight toward Ashford, again. Intelligence estimated their numbers at 10,000, maybe 12. Dan read the letter and sat down. 12,000, 4 times as many as last time. Last time, they barely held out against 3,000. He stood up. He walked over to the wall. The outer ring was 2/3 complete. 2 of the 4 new towers stood. The 3rd was halfway up. The 4th was at the foundation. If he had 2 more months, he would have finished. But he didn't have 2 months. According to Talvar, the horde would be here in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Dan gathered the people, everyone. Over 400 people stood in the square. He spoke from the roof of the smithy, in the local language, loudly, without Hana. He said the enemy was coming, many enemies. He said the walls weren't ready. He said they had to do 2 months' worth of work in 3 weeks. He said every person, every hour, every stone counted. And he said that Ashford had stood against 3,000 and would stand against 12,000, because the walls were built by the hands of the people who lived behind them, and the people who built those walls knew every stone in them. Exclusive videos, story continuations, and bonus content are already available on Patreon before YouTube, so check the link in the description for early access to all new recaps and continuations.